Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, so he kills him. Lamech introduces polygamy into the world. Noah, the most righteous man of his generation, gets drunk and curses his grandson. Okay? Lot is surrounded by the residents of Sodom who want to sexually molest his guest, and so instead he offers them his virgin daughters. These same daughters later get Lot drunk and get impregnated by him, and Lot is called the most righteous man in Sodom. Abraham plays favorites with his sons Isaac and Ishmael, and they're estranged from each other. Isaac plays favorites with his sons Jacob and Esau, and they are bitter enemies for 20 years. Jacob plays favorites with Joseph and his 11 sons. They want to kill Joseph, but they end up selling him into slavery. These people's marriages are a disaster. Abraham has sex with his wife's servant, and then at his wife's insistence, he sends the slave woman and her son off to the Sinai desert to die of thirst. Isaac and Rebekah, they fight. They fight over which boy will receive the birthright, will get the blessing. Jacob ends up with 2 wives, and when they get into a fertility contest, both wives offer him their maidservants as wives as well, so they can win the number of children race. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, has sex with his dad's concubine. Another daughter-in-law of Judah has sex with him when she disguises herself as a prostitute. And she does this because she is childless, because her first 2 husbands, both sons of Judah, were so wicked, God killed them. And then Judah refuses to do the Levirate marriage so she can have descendants. All right? These are not the Waltons, are they? These people are badly messed up. They need Dr. Phil, Dr. Laura, Dr. Ruth, Dr. Spock, Dr. Seuss, Dr. Carson, anybody you want to name. They need it. Anybody here feel a little better about your family about now? Now the question is, why does the writer include all of this stuff in Scripture? Why is all this material in here? These are horrible stories. Genesis 34 is about Jacob's daughter Dinah. She's raped, and Jacob does nothing. So her brothers Levi and Simeon, they respond by suckering the men of Shechem into being circumcised. And while they're still sore from the procedure, they attack them, kill them all, plunder their city. The behavior of all the men in this book is a disgrace. And yet the writer never says they're bad guys. What's the moral to this story? A lot of us wonder, reading Genesis, what in the world is going on? Well, to start with, the author of Genesis is not morally confused. Remember, Genesis is part of the Pentateuch. And the Pentateuch gives us the 10 Commandments. It's the greatest law in the history of the world. It is fabulous. The writer is perfectly capable of saying, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery. And he says those things. But the writer tells us stories because stories force you to think. When you read stories, you have to develop moral discernment. You have to apply some judgment. And there are often kind of moral case studies They're kind of complex with a lot of moral ambiguity. For instance, in the story of Dinah, her brothers respond. They kill the men of Shechem. They plunder their city. Now, that story forces you to ask some questions like, is this justice for Dinah, which is good, or is it revenge, which is bad? And we have to work through. We have to think about these kinds of things. Do these stories have application to our day? You bet they do. Mostly, though, the writer tells us stories because the real hero of the book of Genesis is not a man or a woman. It's God. God is working with real flesh and blood, sinful people in a fallen world where sin does unspeakable damage. And the tendency of the human race is that we try to hide our sins. We pretend they are not so bad. We try to claim that our depravity is manageable. It is not so. And so the writer tells us these stories to let us know that if God can be with that bunch, God can be with you. And that's the theme of our sermon today. If God can be with them, God can be with us. God can be with you and me. This is the theme of the Old Testament, and especially what we're going to look at today. So if you will, you take your Bibles, turn to Genesis 24. And today we're going to study how God was with three great figures who followed Abraham: Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And in each of these men's story, there is this phrase that says, God was with them. And God can be with us. Genesis 24, starting verse 1. No slide change. All right. Whoops, back up. Here we go. Abraham was now old and well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. And he said to the chief servant in his household, one in charge of all that he had, and we know from Genesis this is most likely Eliezer, he says, put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the God of heaven and the God of earth that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I have been living, but will go to my own country, to my own relatives, to get a wife for my son Isaac. Okay? Now, the fear here on Abraham's part is that if Isaac marries a Canaanite woman, she will lead him into idolatry, that she will lead him away from the God of the covenant. And that theme of not marrying outside of your faith beliefs is one that runs through the Old Testament, even into the New. Paul talks about not being unequally yoked together. And we teach that here as an Adventist church, don't we? We talk about that quite a bit. It starts, this idea of not being unequally yoked starts way back at the beginning of the covenant people. So Abraham sends his chief of staff, Eliezer, with a caravan loaded with 10 camels, which is a great indication of Abraham's wealth. But you need to understand how difficult a mission he has given Eliezer. Okay? If you look at this map, there's a yellow arrow there. That's Down at the bottom is where Eliezer was when he got the commission, and up to the era is where he had to go. It's a distance of 400 miles from Israel up to what is now Turkey. Okay? 400 miles across desert. And folks, this is the wild, wild East. Anything could happen to a caravan along that trip. First of all, there's no maps, there's no roads. You just got to find your way. Second of all, any little city, state, or group of brigands can raid the caravan and wipe it out. But even if he makes it to Haran, then what he has to do is to find Abraham's relatives, find an eligible bride for Isaac, and then talk her family into letting this bride come marry some guy they have never met. This is a tough job, folks. All right? Look at what Eliezer does first. Then he prayed, "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham." What's the first thing he does? Eliezer prays. Little side note here. This is the first recorded prayer in the Bible. And it's not even prayed by an Israelite. Okay? I love God's response. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with a jar on her shoulders. Eliezer is still on his knees. He's still praying. And Eliezer saying, "God, you got to help me find the right girl." And God's saying, "She's right there. There she is. Get her, you know." And she exceeds his prayer. She says, "I'll draw water for you and your camels too, until they have finished drinking." Now, here's the kicker. Do you know how much water a thirsty camel can drink? Up to 30 gallons of water. How many camels were they? 10. That's 300 gallons of water she's got to draw up from this well. This is a girl with some serious biceps, right? But God is leading. Not only is she a relative of Abraham, the Bible tells us that she's very beautiful. And here she is. She has no idea what's going to happen. She has no idea that her future in God's covenant community is on the line here. She's just serving. And so, Eliezer goes and meets her family. He gives her some very expensive jewelry. Her father, Laban, which we will meet a little later, is a money guy. And when he sees this jewelry on his daughter, it gets his attention. It takes some diplomatic discussion, some real politic, for Eliezer to convince Laban to let his daughter go marry Isaac, 400 miles away, somebody they had not ever met. But when he has that accomplished, look at what Eliezer did. Then the man bowed down and worshiped the Lord, saying, "Praise be to the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on a journey to the house of my master's relatives." Eliezer knows that God is working. He's not a little local God. He's working everywhere. He's in this foreign country, and God is working. And Eliezer responds by giving thanks and praise and worship. Okay? Now, This story is a God deal all the way through. This is God at work. And I'll tell you what's going on. What is the author getting to in this story in Genesis? What is he trying to get across to us? He is answering one of the great questions that have perplexed minds of religious people for centuries. And that question is, how does God relate to this world? And there are two important terms that you need to know in order to understand how God relates to this world. The first term is the word transcendent. What does that mean? Well, this refers to the fact that God is eternally self-sufficient apart from His creation. All right? God does not need the universe to exist. If our universe was suddenly to just blink and be gone, you and I would be gone, but God would not be. He is still there. He doesn't need His creation to exist. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1 reflects this when it says, I saw God seated on a throne, high and exalted. The King James Version says high and lifted up. It shows God above His creation, apart from His creation. So we believe in a transcendent God. But a transcendent God is not enough. If people believe only in a transcendent God, they end up in what is called deism. Many of you know the founding fathers of our country, a number of them. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson were deists. What is deism? Well, deism is the idea that God created the world but then left it on its own. Like if you watch nature shows, you know, they have this little sea turtle that comes up at night up on the shore, digs a little hole with its fins, lays a bunch of eggs, covers them up, goes back into the ocean, and the eggs incubate and hatch, and the little turtles are on their own. No mama to feed them, to look after them, to take care of them. They just, whatever will be, will be. Okay? That's deism. God created the world, and He said, good luck with that, folks. You're on your own now. So transcendent is not enough. Where are we? Advance the slide. It's gone out all of a sudden. All right, so how does God relate to the world? First, we have a transcendent God. But the other word we need to know is the word immanence. What is immanence? Well, immanence, we go out again. All right. Immanence is the idea that God is continually active and present with us. It's kind of like omnipresence. With omnipresent, we talk about God is everywhere at once, right? God is everywhere present. But with immanence, the idea is that God is everywhere active. Okay? God is not just looking down at this world and saying, boy, that's all interesting what's going on down there. No, he inserts himself into the activities of this world. And we get a text about that, Psalms 138, verse 8. If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the grave, you are there. Wherever I go, God is there. He is watching over me. He is protecting us. But immanence alone is not enough, because immanence without being transcendent equals pantheism. What's pantheism? Pantheism says that God is in all things. God's in this pulpit. God's in this chair. God's in the piano. God's in the grass. He's in the trees, the sun, the moon, the stars. You see, that is the religion of ancient peoples. That's the reason they worship the sun and moon and stars, because God was in all those things. All right? So, what Genesis is doing is Genesis is giving us a new understanding about God. It's never been said before in the history of the world. What's he saying? This transcendent God who is independent of his creation, this immanent God who is clearly present in our world, is Emmanuel, God with us. God with us. Now, the Lord is with Isaac. Genesis 26, 1-3. Here's what it says. And the Lord appeared to Isaac when there was a famine in the land. And God said, don't go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you. And that's a great promise that God makes to Isaac, and he is with Isaac his whole life. Now, Isaac's wife has 2 sons, twins. We turn now to look at Jacob. Jacob is a con artist. He is a scammer. Jacob is always looking for an angle. And he's like that right out of the womb. Look at this text. Then the time came for Rebekah to give birth. There were twin boys in her womb. The first came out, was red, and the whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hands grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Jacob literally means heel grabber, but metaphorically it means deceiver. Deceiver. All right? The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, the man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the camps. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Here's the family dynamic. Esau, he's the man's man. He's the one that wants to go out hunting and fishing. But he's not the brightest bulb in the chandelier. Jacob is a nerd. He stays home and plays with his Xbox and hangs around with the ladies. Daddy loves Esau. Mama loves Jacob. Rebekah teaches Jacob how to deceive his father Isaac so that the youngest son can get the birthright. Jacob dresses up like Esau. He wins the blessing. Now, Esau finds out and he wants to kill Jacob. Jacob has stolen his birthright. Jacob has to flee and go that 400 miles back to Haran to get away from his brother. And it's during this fleeing that God comes to Jacob and says, even though you're fleeing, I have not abandoned you. What I am doing to you, Jacob, is I am sending you to character school. Character school. And Jacob has a dream that's one of the most important dreams in the Old Testament. Remember, he sees this ladder, and there's angels ascending and descending. And God says to Jacob in his dream, they understood dreams were from God. That's the way they looked at dreams. God said, I am with you. I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his dream, and he thought, surely the Lord is in this place. I was not aware of it. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I'm not aware of it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? For it is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Folks, our goal today is for you and I to understand that God is in this place, and you will be aware of it. I want you to be aware of it. And so Jacob wakes up from his dream, you'll remember, and he takes the stone which he had used as a pillow, and he sets it upright, and he pours oil on it to mark, so he will always remember where he met God. And he names the place Bethel. It's from two Hebrew words. Beth means house. El comes from Elohim, the name for God. This is the house of God. This is where God is present. This is the place where he is. So folks, where is the house of God? Where is God present? Everywhere. Everywhere. Right here. Right beside of you. Right now. And God is with you. He is watching over you. He cares for you. He cares about what goes on in your life. And so we want to work so I can say that God is with me and I can see him. This is the beginning of Jacob's transformation. In chapter 29, he goes to Haran, his grandfather Abraham's old town. He has to travel from Canaan the 400 miles up to Haran, and he finds his uncle Laban. In Laban, Jacob meets his match. Jacob is a con artist, but Laban is the king of con artists. A king. And the first thing that happens to Jacob when he gets up there is that he goes to a well to get some water, and he's talking to some people, and then this happens. While he is still talking with them, Rachel came with her father Laban's sheep. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well, and he watered his uncle's sheep. This guy is smitten. All right? He gets one look at Rachel and he is in love. Now, little background here. They used stone to cover a well. And they did that to keep things from falling into the well and contaminating the water. Water is very precious. These stones are huge. They weigh several hundred pounds. They were designed to have several burly shepherds lift them up and move them. Now, you got to remember, Jacob is a nerd. He's an indoor guy. He doesn't have body by Jake. He has body by Jacob, and it is a pathetic body. But he sees Rachel, and he's so in love. He wants to show off. And this love is like steroids. It's like adrenaline. And he goes over, and he moves this rock all by himself. And then we get this odd bit of information. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. Well, that's kind of strange, isn't it? Ladies, do you remember the first time you kissed the man that became your husband? What if you had kissed him and all of a sudden he just broke out bawling and weeping? What would you think? I mean, I asked my wife, I said, what would have happened if the first time we kissed, I just broke down just weeping uncontrollably? And she said, I'd have thought you was pretty weird. This is kind of strange. Evidently, different time, different culture. Okay? But Jacob is smitten with Rachel, and he goes to Laban. Now, Laban has 2 daughters. The oldest daughter is Leah. And Leah has some sort of eye problem. We're not real sure what it is. Some Bible commentators say that Leah was severely cross-eyed. All right? But Jacob loves the younger daughter, Rachel. And so he works out a deal with her father to marry her. And it says Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seem like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Boy, this guy's got it bad. So he works 7 years. When the 7 years are up, then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. My time is complete. I want to sleep with her, lie with her. That's kind of crass, isn't it? You know, being the father of a daughter myself, in some perspective, son-in-law comes along and says, well, give me your daughter in marriage. I want to have sex with her. He'd be looking down the barrel of my shotgun in short order. Don't you think? Now, what happens? The marriage is arranged. The custom of the time, they built a marriage tent. And Jacob goes in, and he gets in bed. And when it is dark, in comes the bride, wearing a veil over her face. She doesn't say a word. This story is told with great economy and some wit. And it says, when the morning came, there was Leah. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. And so Jacob goes to Laban. And he says, what have you done to me? I have served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you, what's the word? Deceived. Why have you deceived me? Now, in Hebrew, it's a little even more interesting because it says, why have you Jacobed me? Uh-huh. Why have you deceived me? And Laban gets kind of indignant here, and he makes a kind of ironic, pointed statement back to Jacob. He says, it is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. And that's a direct jab at Jacob. He says, boy, where you come from, maybe the youngest child takes the rights of the older one, but here, that don't fly. Do you know a young man who took the rights of the older one? Mm-hmm. Jacob later says that Laban had changed his wages, had deceived him, had changed his wages 10 times. Jacob had deceived Laban by not telling him he was going home and just took off. They got this thing going. But you see, Jacob had messed with the wrong guy. He really had. Man, You see, what's going on here is Jacob is on the receiving end of what he has been dishing out his whole life. And he is going through the painful, laborious process of being on the receiving end, because suffering will teach him what nothing else can. Why did you deceive me? So you can learn what it is like to be deceived. Now, I want you to think about Leah's wedding night. This is Leah's one and only wedding night. She puts on a veil. She comes into the tent. And she knows she is only there because Jacob thinks she is her sister. One word from her and the cat would have been out of the bag. But she says not a word. Why? Why? Well, maybe she was afraid of her father's anger. Maybe because of her eye condition, she felt unattractive. No one would ever love her, and any husband at all was better than no husband. Or maybe she was in love with Jacob herself. We will never know. But the tragedy and the sorrow of the unloved sister, the unloved wife, is one of the saddest stories in all of Scriptures. But we read that God sees, God cares, God notices the tears of Leah. For over 14 years, Jacob goes to character school. Jacob the deceiver meets Laban the arch-deceiver and learns about the pain and the humiliation of deception, and he begins to change. God is with him, and he finally decides to return home and to face his brother. It's a courageous thing to do, because Jacob has been a runner and an avoider his whole life. But now he decides to go back, face his brother, live or die. It's a brave thing. And Jacob, on the way, has this great encounter with God. One night this man comes in and Jacob wrestles with him, and he wrestles him all night. And finally in the morning he begins to realize who it is he's wrestling with. And the man says, "Let me go, I've got to go." And Jacob says, "I won't let you go till you bless me." And so God says to Jacob, he says, "I'm giving you a new name. You have been Jacob the deceiver. Now you will be Israel," which means one who wrestled with God and man and prevailed. So Jacob goes to meet his brother, and he devises a plan on how to do it. And the Bible tells us this. It says, "So Jacob looked out the door, and he saw Esau coming with a retinue of men. And so he divided this group in between Leah and Rachel and her servants. He put Leah and her children in front, Rachel and her sons in the rear, and he himself went on ahead." Now that's the key verse. He went ahead. He is not Jacob the dodger anymore. He is Israel the fighter. He will take the risk no matter what. And then there's this beautiful phrase, "But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him." The two brothers, after 20 years, they hug each other. They kiss each other. And they are reconciled. Finally, in this whole tragic story of family relations in Genesis, God's dream of community wins out here just a little bit. Two brothers finally come together in love. And an important statement Jacob makes to his brother. He says, for to see your face is to see the face of God. In Semitic language, what that means is, when I see your face, I discern your character, and your character is like God's. You might know that to be true. You'll be here at church and you'll see somebody across the room and their back is to you. And you think, I'm not sure I know that person. I think I'll go introduce myself and welcome them to church. And you walk up to them, and as you walk up, they turn around to face you. And when you see their face, you begin to know them, don't you? You can look at their face and you can tell their mood. You can look at their face and you can tell whether they have the glow of health or sickness. You can look at their face and sometimes you can tell their social economic level. You can look at their face and you can discern their character. And so Jacob says, to see your face is to see the face of God. Jacob says to Esau, when you are willing to forgive, when you are willing to show mercy, when you are willing to reconcile, then when I see that in you, I see God. Let me ask you this morning, what do people see when they look at your face? It's my goal, and I hope it's yours, that when they look at me, they will see the face of God. Jacob has a son. But before we get there, I want us to look at Genesis chapter 36 for just a second. Chapter 36 begins, this is the account of Esau, which is Edom. If you're reading Genesis really carefully, you will come across this phrase very often. This is the account of. This is the account of. You see, in our Bibles, Genesis is divided into 50 chapters. But you need to understand, the author did not put those chapters in there. Those chapters were added many centuries after Genesis was written. The author of Genesis divides Genesis into 10 sections. And each section begins with, this is the account of. For instance, in Genesis 2:4, this is the account of the heavens and the earth. Genesis 5:1, this is the account of Adam's line. Genesis 6:9, this is the account of Noah. And so on. Now we're down to 37, and it says, this is the account of Esau and the Edomites. Now, the sticking point with this chapter is, to any original reader of Genesis, the Edomites are Israel's worst enemies. In the book of the prophets, there are more words of condemnation against the Edomites than anybody else in Scripture. In fact, the whole book of Obadiah is one long condemnation and judgment against Edom. They're bitter enemies. So any Israelite reading it, all of a sudden he gets to this chapter and he says, why are they interrupting this great story to talk about the Edomites? They're not our people. They're not the people of the covenant. What are they doing in here? Get them out of our book. But the Edomites are in there for a reason. And the author wants you to know that Edomites matter to God. The people we consider our enemies matter to God. God cares about the Edomites. He's saying, don't forget about them. And this is an echo of something Jesus would say years later. Jesus says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And it's reflected just a little bit here in Genesis, the 36th chapter. Now, we go to Genesis 37, and we get to the story of Joseph. Joseph was the son of Jacob's old age. He's number 11 out of 12 boys. Not only that, he is the first son of the favorite wife, Rachel. Okay? She only had 2 sons. Now, you might think that Jacob, after what happened to him in his growing up years, would be very careful not to show favoritism to his sons, but he does not. You see, sin goes down to the second and third generations. He does not. And so he buys this son a coat. It's the adjective used to describe the coat is a little hard to decipher. Some people think it was a coat with long sleeves. The King James says it's a coat of many colors. The point is that Jacob buys this coat at Nordstrom's. He has it tailor-made. It's made of the finest wool cloth. The other sons get their clothes off the rack at Kmart when the blue light is flashing, made out of 100% pure polyester. But the point of the coat is not its expense. It is not its colors. It's the symbol. It means that Joseph is the chosen one. He is the one who's going to receive the birthright. And so more than the cost, there's a money involved. More than the emotion, there is money involved. But all of those things are a part of it. Now, Joseph, being the favorite and younger of the sons, he's a spoiled little brat, as you might imagine. Spoiled rotten. He's the first son of the favored wife. Look at this story. Joseph, a young man, tending his flock with his brothers, the sons of Bela and the sons of Zelpha, his father's wives, and he brought a bad report about them. What do we call a sibling who goes and tells on his brothers and sisters to mom and dad? Tattletale. Tattletale. Tale in the Bible always means a false story, an untrue story, like a fairy tale. Okay? It means an untrue story. And this is a bad story. So the implication here is Joseph makes up bad stories about his brother, and because he's daddy's favorite, he goes and he tells his daddy, and his daddy believes him. He is the favorite son. These sons are the sons of his concubine wives. They are not his favorite. And so the response of his brothers is not hard to imagine. The scripture tells us they hated him. They hated him. And then Joseph has these dreams. All right? He has these dreams. And interestingly, the writer doesn't say they are from God. But this spoiled little kid, he is so self-absorbed, you think he would keep his dreams to himself. But no, he gets his brothers around. I just imagine you're one of the brothers. And your little brat kid brother, spoiled rotten kid brother, gets all of you around and he says, listen guys, I want to tell you a story. I had a dream last night. You see, you all had these little tiny sheaves of wheat, and I had one that stood big and tall, and your little sheaves bowed down to my sheaf. Which means one day I'm going to rule over you. I am going to tell you what to do, and you're going to have to do it. Isn't that cool? Aren't you happy for me? I tell you what, let's play bow down sheaf right now, just to practice. And it says the brothers hated him even more. And he had a second dream, and he told it. He had a third dream where they had the sun, moon, and stars. And they all bowed down to him, which meant that his brothers and his mom and dad would all be at his command. It's hurting his family relations. There's one word that keeps popping up during this story. It's hate, hate, hate. And God decides that Joseph needs to go to character school. And so the brothers sell Joseph into slavery. The boy who had dreamed of inheriting the family fortune is now a slave. That's pretty far down on the totem pole, isn't it? But then there's this verse, and it says, but God was with Joseph. God was with Joseph. He goes down and he's bought by a man named Potiphar, and for a while things go pretty good, but Potiphar's wife makes sexual advances to him and he resists, but he's thrown in jail because of it. And it's when he is in jail that this self-possessed little boy who's never considered anybody else's feelings begins to notice the feelings of his fellow inmates. And he begins to care for someone besides himself. And this is the beginning of Joseph's exaltation. We see what happens. Years later, his brother, Joseph, has become the prime minister of Egypt. His brothers come during a famine looking for food, and they bow and they kneel down to this character who they later find out is their very brother Joseph, and they think, oh boy, we have had it now. He's going to get even with us big time. But Joseph says this, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And that's kind of the theme of all of Genesis. It's a profound theological statement. And now the dream begins to come true. You remember what God promised to Abraham back in the beginning? He says, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And now with the famine and thousands of people who would have died can eat, they are being blessed because of a descendant of Abraham. Where is Bethel? Where is the house of God? Where is God present? Answer, everywhere. The God of Genesis keeps popping up in the most unlikely places. He is with Adam walking in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the evening. He is with Noah in a little tiny boat being tossed to and fro by the waters of judgment that cover the earth. He is with a little boy who has been abandoned by his father Ishmael, who's the son of a slave woman who dad takes out to the Sinai desert and says, good luck to you, and leaves him to die of thirst. He is with a non-Hebrew servant who has been sent on an impossible mission. He is with an unlikely, undeserving con artist in a foreign country who has finally met his match. He is with the golden boy who thought that he would inherit the family fortune, but ends up a slave and in prison, and finally at the right hand of God. From the highest places to the lowest places, God is there. He is Emmanuel, God with us. And this crazy God of Genesis who pops up in the most unusual places has not stopped popping up yet. He is in your life. Look for it.